Good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to this event, Beyond Voluntary, Civil Society Proposals to Address Poverty Wages in Global Garment Supply Chains, a side session to the OECD Forum on Due Diligence in the Garment and Footwear Industry. Welcome, everyone. I'm Raki Shah, CEO of The Circle, and we're delighted to be hosting this session today and bringing together a range of civil society actors to present today and explore legal options to bring change in this area to poverty wages. So we've got some wonderful panelists and moderators, etc. So you're in for a treat this morning. As some background to The Circle, we are a global feminist organisation. It was founded by the singer and songwriter and activist Annie Lennox, and we focus on two areas in particular to support vulnerable women and girls around the world. The first is economic empowerment, which the living wage work fits under, and the second is around ending violence against women and girls, which is a huge priority for us. Our focus is in three ways: funding and partnering with extraordinary grassroots organisations, including supporting garment workers on the ground, through advocacy and structural change, which fits in well with this, and the amplification of stories and voices of women around the world. This is all underpinned by collective action and extraordinary women and allies bringing their skills and resources to the circle to make change. And a great example and shining star of this is our Living Wage campaign, which was initiated in 2015 by our Lawyers Circle network, who was struck by the severity of the issue of poverty wages in the fashion's global supply chains and felt that the law exists to tackle and solve these very issues and injustice. So in the last 6 years, and after many hours of their time alongside activists and key stakeholders, we've published 3 distinct reports, exploring one, the legal foundation that defines a living wage as a fundamental human right, the system failures that perpetuate the problem of poverty wages within the garment industry, and in our third and latest report, we presented a draft regulation built around the concept of a trade mechanism at the border of the EU single market and focusing solely on tier 1, the cut, make and trim element of the supply chain. We're now pleased to be part of a wider coalition, joining a wide range of civil society representatives and bringing together a broad set of proposals. And as we come together to launch a European Citizens Initiative on living wages in the textile and footwear sector. So without further delay, I'm going to hand over to Maeve Galvin, who's also on camera, and who's from the Fair Wear Foundation, who's project manager of the European Citizens Initiative. Maeve will bring some context for our discussion today and explain further about the ECI. Maeve is also going to facilitate the remainder of today's session. For those who want, there's an agenda appearing in the chat box just now. And over to Maeve. Thank you, Maeve, for facilitating today's session.
Thanks, Raki, for that great introduction. And hi, everyone. It's great to be here and to have this opportunity to speak to you all about the work that we're doing on living wages in the garment, footwear and textile sector. I'm going to kick us off by providing a few opening remarks that provide some background on our thinking, and I'll also share a little bit about the development of our forthcoming European Citizens Initiative and why we believe that it can be one of the tangible tools to address poverty wages in the sector. So the rationale for paying workers a living wage so that they can afford a decent standard of living and save a little bit, it's difficult to argue with. We know that wages are the most significant workplace issue for garment and textile workers. We know that there's a huge domino effect. If you resolve the issue of poverty wages, you unlock other positive impacts on a worker's family and their community, and the impact that living wages can have towards achieving multiple sustainable development goals is really clear and significant. And all of this, of course, is much more impactful again in the case of female workers, who make up the vast majority of the global garment sector workforce. Living wages are a very old idea. In fact, they were introduced as a concept long before any of us were born, long before the birth of fast fashion at the Treaty of Versailles more than a century ago. However, the real challenge over the past number of years has not been making the case for the concept of living wages, but in making them a reality on the ground. That part has been excruciatingly difficult for workers and their representatives and for civil society and other advocates. According to the latest Fashion Transparency Index, Only a quarter of big brands even have a stated approach towards living wages. And of those that do, we've seen pledges and targets. However, on paper, commitments on living wages have rarely become a reality. Some companies have made sincere efforts. However, we simply haven't seen enough tangible action, i.e. a modification of actual purchasing practices to enable suppliers to pay their workers a living wage. And we cannot talk about the slow progress on living wages in this sector without giving some attention to the wider crackdown and suppression of worker voice and genuine worker representation that's become so apparent in recent years in many production contexts. Ineke and Kalpona and others better placed than I will talk about that in more detail later. But fundamentally, what we're faced with is, if in even the best case scenario, where there is true collective bargaining taking place, the gulf between minimum wages and living wages is so significant that reaching a living wage via bargaining alone is near impossible in many contexts. So all of this points to the fact that if we continue to wait for living wages to materialize under the current system, which relies on voluntary measures, there's a real danger that it may never happen. So we believe that the lack of accountability for the undervaluing of workers' labor has reached a tipping point. The pandemic crystallized much of the stunning inequality in the sector that pre-existed the pandemic, but hunger and increasing debt levels were dominant themes for millions of workers, and many experienced wage theft, wage suppression, wage disruption, and there were job losses in record numbers. So what we've needed for a really long time is a new lever to pull. Civic power is an entirely new lever, which our European Citizens Initiative, Good Clothes, Fair Pay, intends to harness. For those of you that don't know, a European Citizens Initiative is a tool which compels the European Commission to consider action on an issue, as long as it has the support of at least 1 million EU citizens. So for the past year or so, we've been building a diverse coalition of civil society actors and citizens, and we're close to finalizing an ambitious proposal to bring to the European Commission. And later this year, we'll launch our campaign to gather the signatures of citizens across the EU and get them behind our proposition. The legislation we're calling for would require EU-based garment, textile, and footwear brands, as well as brands selling on the EU market, to conduct due diligence on living wages throughout their global supply chain, to show how they're closing the gap between living and actual wages, including how they're changing their purchasing practices. It's the first time that an ECI has been tried in the sector, and it's the first ECI on this topic. We're not calling for wage setting, which we believe should be done locally by trade unions and worker representatives. But if we're successful, all companies selling to the EU market will be required to ensure that the factories they work with can pay a living wage to their workers. Just a decade ago, striving for binding legislation in the garment and textile sector, particularly to try and regulate brand behavior, was something that seemed highly unachievable. However, we've seen several encouraging developments on the policy front. Ben will talk in more detail later about the policy context and how we're ensuring that our work is building upon what's already been done, and that it's complementary to other key initiatives. Like many of you, we're eagerly anticipating the publication of the EU's Sustainable Corporate Governance file tomorrow, and we're encouraged by the introduction of national level legislation across several European countries, as well as the proposed legislation that we're also seeing coming through, as well as the passing of the Garment Worker Protection Act in California. All of these developments demonstrate that the appetite for regulation is growing globally and is becoming more possible. For a long time, the narrative around living wages has been that they're something of a pipe dream, that they're aspirational rather than a fundamental right. Living wage naysayers believe that there are too many methodologies and that living wages are too complicated to achieve. However, to that we say that that's precisely why we need a streamlined system that everyone participates in. We need a level playing field that factors dignity for workers into the base price of producing garments and textiles, and no longer allows for it to be negotiated away or undercut. It's too difficult for just a few brands to book the trend. Living wages need to be applied across the board. And of course, living wages on a factory by factory or field by field basis are unsustainable in such an interconnected industry. My final point to make before we move to some other speakers is just that this industry moves so rapidly. We're no longer in the era of fast fashion. We're in the era of ultra fast fashion. Physical stores are losing relevance to sprawling online marketplaces, and an item of clothing can go directly from being on a photo on Instagram to being replicated on hundreds of factory floors within hours. The unwieldy beast that is the garment and textile supply chain is becoming even more complex and more difficult to hold accountable. When those drafting the Treaty of Versailles were coming up with the concept of living wages, they couldn't possibly have envisaged the world that we're in. But the basic concept of paying a worker enough to afford them to live a dignified life is timeless. So our feeling is, without harnessing some of the key tools in our toolbox, such as regulation, poverty wages for workers are guaranteed to get worse. So I'll hand over now to Aileen Dussen, who's partner at Hogan Lovells. She's a leading specialist in international trade law, and Aileen's going to provide a technical overview of the legal ECI proposal, which is currently under development. Thanks, everyone. And over to you, Aileen.
Thank you, Maeve. Thank you, everyone, for joining today's session. So as Maeve described, that what I wanted to do for the purpose of the next 10 minutes is really walk you through our two texts, because we have two proposals on the table. It's a policy package that we are proposing at this stage. And when I say we, I should disclose that this is not Hogan Lovells International. We're acting pro bono for the Circle and the ECI, but it's the sort of the both NGOs that are putting force together to propose that policy package. So the first instrument that we propose is a directive. And the second one, as Maeve mentioned, is a regulation. So as I'm sure you are familiar with EU law, you will all know that directive is a bit lighter in terms of it doesn't have any direct effect in the member states. European citizens cannot invoke directly a directive. It more imposes an obligation on member states to transpose what the directive requires and send out into their own national legislation. But it does set out a level of harmonization that all the 27 will have to comply with under their EU law obligation. So the first instrument, i.e. the directive, is sector and issue specific. It's very important for you to bear this in mind because it differs from what we see in what we propose in the regulation, and it will, in a sense, impose due diligence requirements that would sit alongside the obligations that will be deriving from the transposition of the upcoming Directive on Human Rights and Environmental Due Diligence. The directive proposal is in line, as we see it, with the Commission's affirmed objectives that additional complementary legislations in the context of the Due Diligence Directive would be necessary to address high risk and specific sensitive sector, which in the view, of course, as per Maeve's point, includes textile, garments, and the footwear sector. So first of all, in terms of scope of the directive, our proposed directive applies to the entire supply chain of that specific sector and to all companies active in, as I said, textile, garment, leather, and footwear sector operating in the EU internal market. So the directive is more sort of inward looking. It is looking at how the actors operate within the EU borders, as opposed to regulation that is more sort of looking at what happens at the border with an internal market component. But the directive itself is really looking at what's happening on the market here in the EU 27. Our proposed directive sets out specific due diligence obligations for companies that will be falling under the scope of our proposed directive and assigns a role both to the Commission and the member states and the authorities that the member states will have to designate in ensuring compliance with the obligations derived from the proposed directive. So what does the directive do in terms of obligations, first of all? Companies will have to ensure that they carry out effective due diligence with regards to, I quote, living wages, freedom of association, and collective bargaining and precarious contractual arrangements in their operations and business relationships. And what does it include? It includes identifying for the specific operators, identifying and assessing the risk or adverse impacts specifically of workers being paid less than a living wage and or not being able to exercise collective bargaining rights. So those EU operators have a duty both to identify and assess those risks within their supply chain. And second obligation, the operators, the companies will have to implement a strategy to respond to the risk that they will have identified at the first stage of that process. This strategy is designed to prevent or mitigate the adverse impacts that the risk will obviously have sort of identify, which include temporary suspension of trade during mitigation efforts or disengagement from a specific supplier if a mitigation attempts fail. So those two key core obligations gives a role to both the Commission and the member states. It's not all on the companies themselves. The Commission, under our proposed directive, has to do three things, in a sense. First, set out guidelines on methodology to assist companies in fulfilling their due diligence obligation. So sort of, just like the Commission is the guardian of the treaty, it will be the guardian of the obligation of the directive. Secondly, establish timelines for progress towards fulfilling due diligence obligation. And thirdly, the Commission will have to publish a list of recognized living wage benchmarks. That's on the Commission's responsibilities. And then finally, the role of the member states under our proposed directive will be to ensure that the companies that are subject to the scope of the directive will set out specific transparency obligations and requirements for an annual statement, a bit similar to what, for instance, you would be familiar in the UK with the Modern Slavery Act, publishing an annual statement that will report on the strategy and implementation of the obligations that I set out a bit earlier on in my talk. So in addition, and lastly, sorry, but importantly, in addition to this annual statement obligation that the member states will have to implement in their own national legislation, the proposed directive set out a so-called right to information, a bit like a freedom of information type of framework, but directed to the companies for the consumers to request from a company in writing information about how it will address, i.e. the company, actual and potential adverse impacts related to wages and/or precarious contracts in its supply chain. If the request is denied by a specific company or redacted, because obviously we're very mindful with potentially commercial sensitive information, or the information is not already publicly available, or is not deemed commercially sensitive, the applicant has the right to appeal to a competent authority. So there is that potential challenging process here that is also embedded into that proposed directive. So that's on the directive, the proposed directive. The second instrument, part of this policy package, as I said, is a regulation. And the regulation itself focuses more on what is happening at the border and places obligation onto importers and/or traders of products that are imported from specific country. And I will explain a bit how the countries are identified and then are placed post-entry into the custom territory of the EU, placed on the internal market of the EU 27. So the regulation focuses specifically on the measures, as I said, that are taking place at the EU border upon entry into the custom territory of the EU. It is the direction is coming from, I don't know if you will have had the chance to read through the Circle proposal that was published in April 2021, but is accessible on the Circle's website, and the regulation is stemming directly from that proposal. The mechanism of the regulation focuses solely on the tier one of the supply chain, so slightly different from the directive because it targets the cut and sew stage of that specific sort of sector and not all operators of the sector. The regulation places additional obligations upon the European Commission to assess wage levels within production countries and identify jurisdictions that are high risk for low wages within the sector. So a very important word that is that the Commission will have under a proposed regulation that will then directly flow back to what importer and/or traders will have to do when they import products coming from those specific jurisdictions. The objective of the proposed regulation, in a sense, is really to address the market failure driven by the mobility of demand and the high availability of labor in that specific sector, which obviously creates a disincentive for government production country states to increase their statutory minimum wages for fear of losing market shares or business to another cheaper labor country or specific operator based in one of those countries. So under the regulation, in a nutshell, 3 key points for you to note. Firstly, the Commission shall, on the basis of expert advice that possibly could include the ILO, and by reference to local country obligations, determine what we call the wage risk points in the regulation for garment, textile, leather, and footwear producing countries. And this wage risk point is the point below which wages should not fall, a point below which no worker should conceivably sustain a basic, decent life. These points shall then be compared, so the wage risk points shall be compared with the statutory minimum wages applicable to the specific sector in that country. And if the statutory minimum wage falls below the wage risk point, the country or area of a country shall be placed on an annex to the regulation. In what we refer to in the regulation, a list of high risk, low wage country. So that's the first sort of core aspect of that regulation, the establishment of this Annex 1 list of high risk, low wage countries. What does it mean when a country is specifically listed and a company is importing or traded goods from a high risk country? It means that this specific operator must make at a point of importing the product and making an import declaration, the importer / trader of the goods, because it's not always the importer that actually trades and places the good on the EU market. So we make the distinction in the regulation. That specific operator will have to make an import declaration stating that in respect of the goods being imported, it has taken, I quote, all reasonable steps to ensure and verify that those goods were produced by workers remunerated at the level higher than the wage risk points identified in respect of the relevant country or territory in Annex 1. And not to forget that there is also a collective bargaining right consideration here, because the importer also has to state that the collective bargaining rights of those workers were guaranteed by the national law applicable to the relevant territory. So that's the core obligation that will fall on the shoulder of the importer and trader of that specific product. Thirdly, the traders, there is a sort of market surveillance check, just what we see, for instance, on other aspects of EU product law, when a product is falling full of specific regulatory compliance or product standards or CE marking in the EU, the traders shall be subject to export market surveillance checks by a member state competent authority, which the member states will have to designate, which may be the same body as the one that the member states will have designated under our proposed directive. In the case of any infringement, the enforcement body of the member state shall issue a notice of a potential remedial action, if that is deemed necessary, and potentially penalties to be paid by the importer or the trader found in violation of that specific obligation. And lastly, but importantly, the fines that will be potentially administered and implemented under our proposed regulation shall be paid into a central fund provided for in our proposed Article 7, and this fund shall be used to improve labor conditions in garment and footwear producing countries where it is possible to compensate the workers. That should also be done. So those are really the core 3 obligations and requirements under our proposed regulation and forms part of the policy package that also has includes the proposed directive. This is the end of this specific presentation. We're obviously happy to discuss in the Q&A session the proposal in more detail. I hope it was useful. You'll obviously find more information online through ECI and the Circle, and I hope that we can discuss some of those ideas a bit more in detail.
Thanks, Aileen, for that really comprehensive overview. I think, yeah, just to let colleagues know, the link to the Circle's proposal is now in the public chat. And of course, the broader ECI proposal will be available online once it's complete. So I'll hand over now to Ben van Pepperstraat and introduce him to you all. If you don't know him already, he's a human rights and business expert. He advises our European Citizens Initiative and also sits on our Citizens Committee. Ben's going to talk about how we're integrating our ECI proposal with various policy developments. Over to you, Ben.
Thank you very much, Maeve, and also thank you very much to the organizers for bringing us together for what is a very interesting panel, if not one of the most interesting panels around this OECD forum. So I've got the daunting task to situate the ECI and Circle proposal within the larger policy context of what's currently happening at the EU. And it is daunting in that aspect that the key anticipated legislation, namely the Sustainable Corporate Due Diligence Directive, because it's now renamed, it was previously called the Sustainable Corporate Governance Directive, is only due to come out tomorrow. And so that means that given that I do not possess the powers of the looking into the future, we can only really situate these proposals on rumors, but the rumors do point ourselves into a consistent direction. First and foremost, I think the policy landscape is clear. This commission does want to restore a set of confidence of activists, but also citizens in both the quality of the products as well as the companies that are operating in the EU, that these are working with respect to key human rights. That is clear. You see that in at least the debates on trade policy. You see that in the policy projects that this commission has. There is, again, the sustainable due diligence proposal upcoming, which would lay out rules for businesses to do human rights and environmental due diligence. But there's also a sustainable products initiative ongoing, and there's equally a textiles initiative ongoing, just to say that there's a whole policy landscape of issues going around. At the same time, as often, there might be more ambition in the discourse than in the actual policy proposals themselves. For example, when we look at trade, the Commission has come out with a GSP regulation, which is one of the main trade regimes where garment is situated. And that proposal for GSP regulation is more or less rehashing what we already had in the previous regulation. The same thing of the textile strategy. The first rumors around that is that it does not contain much ambition beyond some greening, and certainly not going rigorously and legislatively intervening on key human rights risks, such as what the proposal of the ECI does, namely living wage, freedom of association, collective bargaining, etc. So we are only left then with the sustainable due diligence proposal that is set to come up tomorrow. And here, I think it's important to situate the initiative as a sectoral initiative, in the sense that the Commission proposal tomorrow will make a proposal to the co-legislators, namely Council and Parliament, to install due diligence requirements to all companies regarding of sector above a certain threshold. And it is expected that that threshold is going to be 500 employees and 40 million euro worth of annual turnover. But at the same time, it does recognize that there are a number of high-risk sectors. And unsurprisingly, the textile, leather, and relating products, so footwear sector, is one of those high-risk sectors that is anticipated to be part of the proposal. And there, the threshold will actually lower to companies with between 250 and 500 employees. So the medium-sized companies would be captured within that proposal. However, nevertheless, this remains a relatively narrow proposal in the sense that in total, this would capture roughly 1% of the companies active in the European Union, and especially in a sector like the clothing sector, the garment sector, there are a lot of relatively small companies operating who have actually significant human rights risks, living wage risks, freedom of association risks in their own individual supply chains. So that is one of the big caveats. I even referred to one of the sessions, side sessions earlier today, where a researcher from Vietnam actually highlighted a lot of unfair trading practices happening, particularly by small and medium companies. So there is a big open hole potentially left by the upcoming proposal. And this is one of the places where the proposal, the European Citizens Initiative, really comes in as a handy complement because it actually plugs one of those holes. It is not unlogical that there is sectoral legislation that goes a bit more ambitious than the general obligation. We've seen it as well in conflict minerals. We see it also in forestry products. We see it in timber. And similarly, the ECI proposal would create more ambition level there as well. The other place where there's potentially much more ambition is also the value chain scope. The Commission, again, in rumors, in its upcoming proposal tomorrow, might potentially limit at least the enforceability of the obligation to what is called established suppliers, which is not necessarily the most appropriate term for a relatively volatile sector such as the garment and textile sector. And here the ambition to cover the entire supply chain, as presented by Aline earlier, does provide, again, a very welcome complement to what the Commission is currently contemplating. And then the last element where I think this directive is, this proposal for a directive is adding significant ambition level to the Commission, is that the Commission is anticipated tomorrow to come up with a list of all human rights that need and environmental impacts that need to be covered. And those, again, are expected to be very, very comprehensive. There's the International Covenant, which also does recognize the right to fair wages. But in the proposal for a directive, as well as in the regulation, as presented by Aline, the Commission takes a much more, or would be required to take a much more ambitious role in also operationalizing what do these human rights impacts mean, namely by recognizing the benchmarks or by determining in the regulation the wage risk point. So rather just than saying to companies, here is a list of instruments, just do your due diligence with it, here the Commission is much more actively intervening and saying, like, this is what I think are the benchmarks to which you need to orient yourself on a practical basis while you are identifying, while you are assessing all those facilities that you're sourcing from that are in your value chain. So in that sense, the directive proposed by civil society is a very welcome invitation to increase the ambition level that is expected tomorrow by the Commission in its horizontal legislation. And it's really an invitation to the co-legislators, that the Council, where the Member States sit, and the Parliament, who are next in move, to really think how in a high-level risk sector, such as textile and garment, we should cover much more companies, have a whole value chain approach, and also be very concrete on what are the wage risks, the freedom of association risks, and the collective bargaining risks that we want to address. I'll leave it with there, but happy to answer much more questions later on.
Thanks so much, Ben, for that helpful, comprehensive overview. I think it's been really important for us to acknowledge that we're part of an ecosystem of policy activity in this space. Just a reminder to everybody, please do add questions and comments to the chat, as we'll have an opportunity to do a Q&A with the panelists a little bit later. But for now, I'd like to introduce Ineke Zeldenrust, who is the International Coordinator of Clean Clothes Campaign, CCC. CCC are a major campaign partner in the ECI and bring decades of campaigning experience to it. And Ineke is going to talk us through some of the broader wage efforts that are happening in the space, as well as providing more context on some of the realities that workers are currently facing and why this particular issue is so urgent. Over to you, Ineke.
Yes, thank you so much, Meave, and thanks to my other panelists. I'll try and keep this brief because you've all received already a lot of information. A few things to point out. Firstly, even pre-COVID, the gap between living wages, even with conservative, very conservative benchmark estimates, basically estimates that would be, around the wage risk point as described. So the gap between the legal minimum in most production countries and living wages is about a factor 3 to 4, meaning wages would need to triple or quadruple to actually meet that very minimum standard. I think that's important to keep in mind, that is really what workers need for basic survival. It's also not just limited to outside of the EU. That includes countries in EU-based production countries in former Eastern Europe, where actually wages would need to quadruple. Where we also were at is that despite a lot of efforts, and that's linked to the title of this session, voluntary measures over the past 20, 25 years to decrease that gap have largely failed at the level of impact. So workers haven't seen their wages increase or haven't seen that gap diminish. Where there has been progress is a lot of knowledge has been gathered on calculating that gap, on largely agreeing how big it is, but also on a practical level in calculating what would, for example, be the price increases needed for brands to make sure that employers can afford that wage increase. Now, I want to briefly touch on two campaigns that Clean Clothes Campaign has been involved in, one that started pre-COVID and then a bit on the work around COVID, and then look at how that links to the proposals around the European Citizens Initiative, the Directive and the regulation. So before COVID started, we embarked with other allies on a campaign called Wage Forward, which was aiming to reach a binding and enforceable contract between unions, civil society on the one hand, and companies, both brands and suppliers on the other hand. It's modeled around the Bangladesh Accord, and its very basic premise was that brands would pay a top-up on the freight on board price, which is the price they pay for their goods, and they would be also make sure that where there is an independent union active at their supplier, that union gets to negotiate with the employer on the disbursement of that top-up, and basically include that in the CBA negotiation. Where unions are not yet active, there would need to be a direct transfer and the top-up would need to be visible on the payslip. But again, provisions in that contract would also empower unions going forward. Now, when COVID hit, as already I think Meave mentioned and some others, what we saw happening was wage theft really increasing on a massive scale. And a lot of the, again, voluntary obligations of companies to slowly improve went quickly out of the window. And what we've seen is workers would either receive no payment, no overtime payment. They would in many cases see their hours reduced without a corresponding social security payment. And we've seen, and it's still increasing, massive severance theft. So that is usually severance is what workers are supposed to get when a supplier closes. It's a couple of months of wages, which is left unpaid. Now, in the first year of COVID alone, that wage theft, COVID-induced wage and severance theft amounted to $12 billion US. This threw a lot of workers even further in debt than they already were. Combined with massive inflation, rising cost of healthcare, workers have literally been foregoing meals over the past years. Our response has been, as an urgent measure in the short term, to launch the Pay Your Workers campaign, which, similar to Wage Forward, envisaged a contract between brands and companies on the one hand and unions on the other hand, with a lower FOB top-up, basically 10 cents a t-shirt, which would cover COVID-related wage theft and severance going forward, and set up a severance guarantee fund where workers could send claims, not just for COVID-related severance, but also other cases in the future where severance is unpaid. Pay Your Workers by no means that Wage Forward isn't at the same time still necessary or an active campaign. It was a measure, a call, if you wish, around the time that brands were themselves in financial difficulties. Right now, where financial recovery is happening for brands, or some brands weren't impacted at all due to online measures, those two campaigns will still both be necessary, because both severance and wage theft need to be covered and a living wage forward is needed. Now, how does this connect to the proposals that we're discussing right now? If you look at the due diligence component of the European Citizens Initiative, severance is a known human rights risk. Joining a severance guarantee fund will help brands and employees prevent that risk and mitigate harm. Similarly, the failure to close the gap between the legal minimum and living wages means that workers are not able to meet their basic needs unless they work massive overtime, which again contributes to forced labor. Obviously, if we have public legislation, and that's why we are a part of this European Citizens Initiative, that would cover all companies instead of us having to campaign on individual companies to sign a contract that then is enforceable in a court of law. So the EBA, or enforceable brand agreement approach, means that it's legally binding, but it's only legally binding upon those that actually sign the contract. Having the EU put in place legislation means that everybody is covered if they are operating inside the EU, of course, and if they fall within the scope of the law. And I think Ben already pointed out that there are loopholes and foreseen around scope and around size, or around the extent to which it goes into the supply chain. And this supply chain, of course, always is very clever at finding those loopholes. Nevertheless, we are looking at making sure that the thoughts and ideas that we have around those two campaigns, Wage Forward and Pay Your Workers, at the practical level can be included in the proposed legislation. And that's quite important because, in a way, they present a bargaining approach and to making sure that these things happen, a direct way of involving production country unions in the practical way of implementing the law. And I think Aline said that the directive would make sure that companies have to implement a strategy for due diligence, and the two campaigns, the two enforceable brand agreements proposed, in a way present details of what such a strategy could look like. Because with any law, there always is a big risk that if the law is not specific enough, brands will start making up their own strategy. And then, even though it can be enforced, the enforcement will be hampered by the law itself not being clear and specific on the how. So I think that is why we are looking at running the campaigns, making sure that the legislation matches up, using the campaigns to cover both companies that might not fall under the legislation, but also hopefully once there is a closing of that gap between the living wages and the minimum wages, unions can again stand on the floor of the minimum legal wage and bargain upwards. I should lastly point out that we have been very clear that even if there is a situation where brands do sign enforceable brand agreements, that doesn't mean they can escape from liability under the legislation, as we hope will happen as part of the campaign for the European Citizens Initiative. I'll leave it at this for now, because I'm sure there will be a lot of questions. And as I said, there's already been a lot of information. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much, Annika. So next, we wanted to get some reactions from our colleagues working in particular contexts to make sure that we're capturing a broad spectrum of industry perspectives. So to that end, we have joining us Kalpona Akhtar, who is founder of the Bangladesh Center for Worker Solidarity. We have Joanna Maiden, who is founder and director of Soko Kenya, a manufacturer, and Tiffany Rogers, who is director of Fair Compensation and Member engagement at the Fair Labour Association, who represent multiple brands and manufacturers as part of their affiliates. Kalpona, let me start with you. What would living wage legislation mean for RMG workers in Bangladesh? And crucially, if we did manage to achieve legislation, how can we ensure that this doesn't become another nice on paper exercise that doesn't really benefit workers?
Thank you, Maeve. It is really important panel that I was been listening to, and fortunately, I'm one of the fortunate one that I know pretty much all of this, legislation that you have been speaking, and I'm deeply involved in the Clean Clothes campaign, both on Wage Forward and Pay Your Workers campaign. And I'm also the ambassador for Circle. So, it all means that I'm in it. And how does it mean it? Well, it is very crucial for us and for our workers to have a living wage here in Bangladesh. The minimum wage, we just, led our workers to live in a poverty wages. 85 euros a month, which is minimum wage, is not enough for workers' full month cost. And that speaks volumes. What if, they have children, 2 children at home? They're literally starving. And the COVID made our workers' life more difficult. It definitely made a wage gap, and they had to, first thing they had to cut their meals, and that includes their children's meals as well. If we would have a living wage, long before, maybe our worker would be getting the opportunity to make a savings for this kind of emergency to tackle it. Like, we don't have living wage, and not only that, we don't have social protection, we don't have unemployment insurance, and country doesn't have any social security for its citizens. So the situation is really dire. So all this, the presenter, the speakers, when you were talking about ECI, when we are talking about the circle legislation and Pay Your Workers campaign and Voice Forward, it is all sounds great to us. And it will be not, laid as another piece of document if we have a binding obligation on it. So it has to be enforceable, and it has to be transparent and accountable. And that only, make difference here in the ground for workers in production country like Bangladesh and others. It will make difference that, somebody need to be accountable to the consumers or to the, to the other counterpart that, yes, these workers has been ensured their living wage. And one other point that I wanted to add, without having the brands, retailers, like companies on board and getting a share from them, the financial contribution, it would be quite impossible to ensure a living wage in the production countries. Over to you, Maeve.
Thanks, Kalpona. Loud and clear there. Joanna, I'd like to bring you in, if I can. Joanna is founder and director of SOCO Kenya, and you're an employer who's been a leading employer on wages and fair compensation for a really long time. What would legislation mean for you and your operational context?
It's really exciting to hear all of this. As you said, so I started 13 years ago. My factory at 13 years ago, we were 4 people. We're now 130. So we're in the very small, the bottom gap that wouldn't actually tick the 350 employees. But we started because we wanted to prove that it was possible to put people first by paying living wages, providing childcare, providing a promotion structure, and environmental considerations such as we have solar, we do rainwater collection, we upcycle our waste. And we employ a lot of people who have come from other factories. We're surrounded by other clothing factories, and the stories that we hear of their experience compared to what we offer in our space. I remember someone, when they were being interviewed for quite a senior role, said, can I just ask a question? How do you actually get anything done? Because I don't hear anyone shouting. And so, as we all know here, there's living wage is one part of a big picture of how people are treated. And what it's been really interesting to hear about everything. And I guess a question that I have is, what's the kind of timeline expectations for implementation for companies? Because obviously this is a huge shift in terms of money, and as we've seen so often, the additional costs of business get pushed down to the supplier, and then the supplier is forced to find clever ways to move that money about. And then when exposés come about, that goes back down to the factory. So how is the pressure not put down to reduce costs while paying a living wage? Because the money has to come from somewhere.
Absolutely. Thanks, Joanna. And we'll definitely talk about that in the Q&A, as it's always top of the forefront of suppliers' concerns, and rightly so. I'm just going to bring in Tiffany now from FLA as well to get into some reactions from kind of a broader industry perspective. Tiffany, the FLA obviously has several major brands and manufacturers among your affiliates, but you've also been a leading actor in terms of developing tools to map the progress of living wages and actually show how it can be done. What would living wage legislation mean for you and your affiliates?
Thanks, Maeve, and thanks everyone for joining, and thanks to the Circle for hosting this really important webinar and panel on living wage and providing that overview of the legislation. So I think at the Fair Labor Association, we are a multi-stakeholder initiative, and Maeve, as you mentioned, we have some of the largest footwear and apparel companies globally working on this initiative. We have over 51 members. And a few years ago, back in 2015, we decided that we really needed to prioritize fair compensation and living wage, and develop tools for our members to actually measure what wages were looking like for their within their factories and how to use that to ensure progress. And so we developed a wage data collection methodology. We aligned that with Richard and Martha Anker, who are the living wage experts within this field. And we started to use the Global Living Wage Coalition living wage estimates to see what wages look like in the apparel sector, but also to use that as a way for our members to understand what the living wage gap was and what they needed to do to make progress. And I'm sorry, my dog is trying to enter into this panel as well. But what we found, though, is a significant living wage gap. I think that has been mentioned by Inika and Kalpona already. In Bangladesh, we found that our members had a 46% wage gap with the Global Living Wage Coalition and benchmark in 2020. And to us, that just means we need to make more progress on improving wages, looking at things like collective bargaining, purchasing practices, and other levers to improve wages for workers, also looking at how those compensation systems are set up within the factory to make those improvements, and incentivize workers to ensure that they're earning a living wage during the regular work week. And we also found that excessive overtime within the fashion industry is also one of the ways that living wage progress cannot happen, that it's a lever to push wages down because workers have to work so long to even just meet their basic needs. And so to the proposal, what it means for FLA members is it evens out the playing field. Our members are collecting wage data, measuring their progress. They are required to have a fair compensation blueprint that is their strategy to improve wages across their priority countries. By risk and by sourcing leverage. And then I think maybe to your point, we required that they had a public commitment by the end of last year. And so we're really working with our companies to push progress on living wage, uphold that commitment, and also ensure that there's work happening within their companies, within the factories to make that progress happen. On the proposal itself, I think one of the areas, and I think one of the concerns that was raised on having a check the box approach and wanting to avoid that. I think it's really important that there's independent verification built into the legislation, that it's not just based on self-reporting of companies' progress, and that independent verification is worker-centric, that there's a focus on workers verifying that their wages are actually meeting a level of living wage. And so I'll just pause there and Maeve continue to take it away.
Thanks, Tiffany. Lots there. And I'm seeing the messages are coming in from those participating. So maybe I'll just go in order of what we've received. And I'll also ask my fellow colleagues who are panelists and participants to join in. The first question I've seen is just the question of piece rate workers. obviously we want to make sure that this ECI legislation, or what the form that the legislation takes, doesn't miss a trick by not encompassing the needs of piece rate workers. And what we're calling for is, of course, for piece rate workers to be able to make a living wage within the standard working hours, which is, of course, 48 hours per week. And of course, there's broader conversations about piece rate in general as a challenging mechanism for workers' rights. I'm not sure if any of my other colleagues want to jump in and contribute to that point. Do raise your hand if you'd like to, and if not, I'll move along to other questions that we've been asked as they're coming in fast, which is great. Legislation doesn't miss a trick by not encompassing the needs of piece rate workers. And what we're calling for is, of course, for piece rate workers to be able to make a living wage within the standard working hours, which is, of course, 48 hours per week. And of course, there's broader conversations about piece rate in general as a challenging mechanism for workers' rights. I'm not sure if any of my other colleagues want to jump in and contribute.
Maybe just that we need the 1 million signatures, right? And hopefully more. I mean, this in the end will be, we can make excellent proposals. I think we know that. And, we have all this knowledge and we have all these great ideas. But at the end of the day, this will depend on our campaigning power to really not just get across the line of 1 million narrowly, but get across the line of 1 million massively. And I'm hoping that that's what we can do.
Yeah, absolutely. So we are still looking for collaborators and co-conspirators as well. So hopefully if any of you do feel inspired or see a way that you can contribute, do get in touch with us as well afterwards. And our colleagues at the Circle will certainly show you how to do that. Ben, you had your hand up. Did you want to jump in?
Yes, maybe very quickly. I think it's good to also highlight that what this is about is also to a certain extent power. It's about redistribution. If workers get a living wage, that means that somebody else gets less money. That money needs to come from where, and people generally, or companies generally, don't like parting with money so much. So it's about power and counterpower. And if you then look in relationship to the EU Sustainable Due Diligence proposal, I think the last year that we've seen lots of indications of massive lobbying by industry, the German industry, the French industry, etc., who were already trying to narrow down the European proposal. So in that sense, a proposal that has 1 million signatures of citizens is a very powerful political signal. And I think we should not underestimate that part of the power building and the counter power building either.
Yes, thanks, Ben, for the reminder on that. And I think this one is a complex one, and I'd love to hear a few different perspectives on it. But Joe's central question, which was the timeline of implementation, and how do we ensure that suppliers don't get squeezed by these efforts? This is something that our ECI coalition has thought about a lot. But I'll allow Aileen, Ben, and Inika to share their views, and I can contribute a little bit too. But how do we make sure suppliers don't end up feeling the brunt of living wage legislation?
Yeah, I think this is it's important to highlight that the proposals are about human rights due diligence. So in that sense, it's really upon making sure that these suppliers are able to be to pay workers. So in that sense, it sort of protects us, at least ideologically, from the taking with one hand and then giving with the other hand kind of approach that I think the question implicit. Because if you then take it at the other side, maybe in lower prices somewhere else or in longer payment terms, then you come again into the problem that the manufacturer won't be able to pay. And so it is human rights due diligence to achieve something, namely living wages. So in the end, you must ensure that that goal, that objective of living wages actually gets achieved in one form or another. And so I think we need to keep that in mind, that is baked into the human rights due diligence, namely the objective of respecting human rights. And in this specific case, living wage and collective bargaining and freedom of association.
Like I said in the beginning, there's a lot of knowledge there. So first, it needs to be very clear that there should be no below cost pricing. right? Theoretically, the money to pay the workers the living wage needs to be there. We know that that on average means a top up of FOB of around maximum 24%, but it can get lower. It's probably between 16 and 24%. That math has been done based on that gap. And like I said, the payment of severance would be a much smaller portion. At the same time, we also know, and if you, that brands have continued to be massively profitable. And in theory, the supply chain can afford that price increase. So yes, it should not be put only on the suppliers, but the supply chain as a whole can afford to make that increase. And that is where legislation, of course, around below cost pricing or around other matters is really interesting. The other thing that components that are really important is once that money is on the table, then it actually goes to the workers and it doesn't get stuck somewhere in suppliers either expanding or growing or gets lost elsewhere in the supply chain. That's where the relationship with collective bargaining as a tool for and wage bargaining comes in, but also where the relationship comes in with making sure that the legal minimum wage increases. And we need to achieve those two things in tandem across the supply chain. And that is what makes it complex. And that is why maybe the ECI proposal sounds complex. But I think if implemented as intended, it will definitely avoid this happening to suppliers. And therefore, I would also like to see suppliers actually supporting these campaigns. Because we have supported suppliers in our pay up campaign when brands refuse to pay orders. We haven't seen suppliers supporting us in our pay your workers campaign. And that would really help us. And it would also really help us, of course, if they would do that publicly and on the record.
Thanks, Annika. And I think with that call to action, I'm realizing that we're about to go over time in terms of our allocated time. And we do really need those allyships from across the industry and across Europe, but actually globally as well. To make to the earlier point, we are trying to reach more than 1 million people. So I really would encourage those of you that are interested to get in touch and share how you'd like to get involved. So I'll start to wind us down and just thank all of you for participating in such a rich discussion in terms of moving forward. We'll share in a follow-up communication how folks can get involved with the various campaigns, and I urge all of you to sign up to the ECI newsletter on our webpage, which is goodclothesfairpay.eu. We're communicating a little bit now, but we'll start to communicate much more in the coming weeks and months as the campaign kicks off. And the Circle will send around a note to all participants with any follow-up contact information. So with that, many thanks to everyone for participating and wishing you all fruitful rest of sessions and a good afternoon. Thanks everyone, and thanks to our panelists and participants particularly.